Hi, everyone. I'm DeFi Dad. This is episode 20 of Yield TV. All right, it's Friday, and I've got the pleasure of interviewing Akin Sawyerr. So, Akin, welcome to Yield TV.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Today, we're gonna talk about your experience building crypto communities, also as an investor. I think you have a lot of insights that you've covered actually previously on Pomp's podcast, talking about the opportunity to see real adoption, especially in Nigeria, where you were born. So we want to cover all of that, but also some recent news with PayPal. Just with PayPal sort of jumping into the markets, I'm interested to know like what you see as the impact of all of this. So anyways, why don't we just start out per usual with your background, who you are, how you got into this space. Take it away, Akin.
Sure. Actually, I was born in the United States. I was born in Massachusetts, but I grew up in Nigeria through high school and then moved back for college, and I've been here since.
Yeah. And wait, so what age were you when you moved to Nigeria?
I was just a few months old. Like my parents were kind of like finalizing grad school, and so moved back about a year, maybe a little less than a year after I was born.
Wow.
So yeah.
Very cool. And so anyways, so you grow up in Nigeria. Tell me more about that. Like what brought you back then you're in the DC area now,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. So grew up in Nigeria through secondary school and moved back. I mean, I guess the plan for my parents was always moving back here for college. We spent lots of summers here growing up, so it wasn't like a foreign space for us. And so I went to college in upstate New York, a small liberal arts college called Union College, and got a degree in economics. My dad went there. I've had about 7 family members go through Union, so we're kind of legacies at Union College.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and so after college, I moved down to DC to take a job at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which was a very sort of interesting experience. I was there for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. Growing up in Nigeria, the IMF was, next to whoever was president, the IMF was like a mainstay institution, right? Because through the 80s, a lot of African countries were taking and raising debt from the IMF, and in many ways were answering to the IMF in terms of economic policy. So that was an interesting first job. It was really eye-opening into, just the politics around, international finance, right? And the role that the US government and its basically, international institutions really played in international economics and finance. And so after that, I spent a year at Freddie Mac, actually, after that. And then I went to business school. I got my MBA at Dartmouth, then moved back down to DC again. Spent, the bulk of my career in management consulting with Accenture and Booz Allen Hamilton, mostly in the public sector. So I spent time at Homeland Security. I spent time at financial reg agencies, like Treasury and IRS. And then, about 10 years ago, I decided to sort of go off on my own and focus more on what I saw as the emerging fintech space in Africa. So mobile payments, mobile money was beginning to emerge. M-Pesa had already started getting traction in Kenya. For those who don't know, M-Pesa is basically an SMS text-based money transfer system within Kenya, and I think it's since expanded to a couple other countries. But it really took off. Mobile just kind of accelerated in terms of mobile payments, mobile banking. And so that was sort of my first foray into kind of like fintech and kind of innovation, I suppose, in terms of financial innovation. And so that got me into crypto because I invested in a mobile payments company in Sierra Leone, and we're looking into remittances because we began to just learn about how much interest there was from third parties who wanted to remit money into the country, and just some of the challenges structurally that existed. And so I got into, I'd say I got into Bitcoin maybe in 2015, just peripherally. It was like this risk asset.
Yeah.
I bought some Bitcoin, I bought some Ether, but I really started getting down the rabbit hole when I realized that, blockchain from a protocol standpoint could do a lot of interesting things, right? And potentially could it solve this remittance problem? And that's sort of how I got into the space. Eventually started looking at crypto governance, and realizing that, as long as you have people, in communities, like governance is always going to be an issue. And it's always going to be something that drives culture, that drives the nature of how a network grows. So it's just a very big area of interest for me as well.
There's like so many like questions going off in my head there. Thank you. That's so interesting. Gosh. Okay. So let's start with, as you're growing up, how do you think you thought about money differently? And I guess I'm more curious as to like I think getting outside of the bubble of the United States, like I think many of us who have grown up every year in the United States, I think that like I took money for granted. I took a fiat currency that was working really well. Anyways, talk to me more about that. And I guess I'm more interested in what you were saying too about like why the IMF was such a big deal for you growing up, or just being like more aware of what the IMF is.
Yeah. So, I mean, my dad was a banker, right? All my life. And, well, till he passed away. And it was always, finance was always something that, was just around my life, right? I think initially I wanted to be a banker when I grew up. But growing up in Nigeria in the 80s, in particular, in the 1980s, in the mid 80s in Nigeria, like the Nigerian currency was stronger than the US dollar, right? Because of just the oil boom that happened in the late 70s, right? We were basically awash with dollars, very, very strong currency. And, in the mid 80s, we went through a series of structural adjustments. It was called like structural adjustment program, right? A lot of African countries actually went through that. It was basically dictated by the IMF, the World Bank. Like it was just a policy. And the idea there was that, if you devalue your currency, all things being equal, like in economics, then your economy looks cheaper to investors, right? So the idea was that you devalue your currency and then money flows into your economy, right? People invest in land, they invest in assets, and your economy grows. And on paper, that, seems to make some sense, right? But the problem was, we had military governments in Nigeria, right? So security and sanctity of your assets were always a question, right? Because what happened if a new guy like took over next year, nationalized all assets, seized foreign assets, like you have zero, right? So that existential risk, in my view, would stop any rational person from thinking twice about investing in an economy that looks cheap, right? That looks relatively, from a cost advantage, looks interesting. And so we went through a series of that to the 80s. We had poor governance too, but we had a series of devaluations of our currency. Now, if you devalue your currency and the economy doesn't grow and jobs don't grow and salaries don't grow, people just get poorer every day, right? So, I mean, I remember like growing up and like, you could buy a ticket to the United States for $180 in the 80s, right? You could buy, the average person, middle class person could like live fairly well. You could buy a chicken for $6, like it was, no, 6 naira, like that was cheap. And today, our currency is basically around, 470 naira to $1 in less than a generation. And incomes have not grown anywhere near that, right? Job growth hasn't shown up. So, we've just gotten poorer and poorer as a nation, right? The middle class has just basically been gutted. Like you basically have the ultra wealthy who have ties to the government or, might have built an enterprise, entrepreneurs are beginning to do well. And you have just the mass market that's just struggling. And then on the extreme, you have, abject poverty. Nigeria has the largest number of, I think the term is basically like, it's a term basically for the poorest of the poor. Like we have the largest number of people in the world in abject poverty, right? So, that's sort of a background and context of where I grew up. And so going to the IMF, it was very sort of like, well, this is an institution that really matters and mattered in my childhood and right? And so it was this idea that, okay, let's kind of figure out what's behind the curtain. And, the moniker is always, they're trying to do the best for you. They're trying to, push down good economic policies. a lot of these organizations are also very politicized, right? And they basically serve the best interest of the institutions that have the most power in them, right? It's rational, right?
Yeah.
If the U.S. is the largest funder of the IMF, then the IMF is going to push pro-U.S. economic policy across Africa, right? And tilt the scales to ensure that, the U.S. and the West has an advantage. And to me, basically, that's the story of Africa over the last generation, right?
Yeah.
Pick any country, and especially the very large resource-rich countries, Nigeria, Congo, right? And you'll find that they're at various levels of being basket cases because there's just so much economic value to extract, right? And Africa, in my view, has just been a massive subsidy to the rest of the world for the last 40, 50, 60 years. and so that's the context, right, under which a lot of people live, under which people understand money and finance and how economies work or don't work.
Yeah.
And when you introduce crypto, like it serves a number of purposes, right? It's this idea of economic freedom, because I'm now hedged against an asset that I control that is not subject to like the poor economic policies I might be living under. And gives one, like, it's freedom, right? It's freedom to transact globally.
Yeah.
Most Nigerians or most Africans till today don't have, unless you're privileged and you have access, right? So there's just a necessity to survive. And if people can leverage crypto as a way to, put food on their table, right? Trade with the guy next door, import products and sell, and they will, right? They will, as rational actors.
What do you think then are the most promising use cases right now of crypto? Like I always think of with what like narratives I've followed and like the podcasting interviews that I've listened to, which I think one of them was actually the founder of is it BitPesa? Am I saying that correctly? It's SMS based. I clearly understand the power of Bitcoin in these different countries you're talking about. And then there's I think about, of course, DeFi now. So I'm wondering, like, based on like, I guess, reading like your tweets and listening to your one podcast, my understanding is you are one of the people who like really gets DeFi and Bitcoin. Like you're covering both communities very well. And I'm curious, what are the use cases that you think have the best chance of seeing adoption in the near term?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the African landscape today, the largest use case for me is, international settlement of transactions, right? So people are using Bitcoin, they're using and increasingly using stable coins as a way to trustlessly settle global transactions, right? Nigeria, as an example, is a massive import economy, right? We export oil and gas, but like the majority of the economy is trading, right? It's the ability to import and export. You export raw materials and you import finished goods, right? So just about every car on the road in Nigeria is imported, right? Save for a local manufacturer called Innoson, and like I think there might be some other manufacturing, but the vast majority of cars are imported. Like that's a small business guy who's probably importing a dozen cars a month, making a margin and doing well. Now, if you cannot access US dollars or euros or pounds, he has no business, right? And over the last few years, as we've gone through just economic slowdowns in Nigeria, oil prices are dropping. There's just less money in the system. That's foreign exchange. Like the little guy is basically getting shut out of the foreign exchange market. So what does he do? He's like, well, this thing, Bitcoin, is accepted globally, right? I could buy it at a local exchange or peer-to-peer. I could still make a margin on my business, regardless of the volatility, regardless of the transactions costs. And so to survive, people have had to use Bitcoin, right? And like everyone else, once you get into Bitcoin and start learning certain things about it, you realize you can exchange it for other tokens, right? For stable coins. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, there's like a parallel financial economy that people become part of, and they just don't leave because it just makes a lot of sense to them. Right.
Yeah.
It makes sense in so many ways. And so I think for me, like this idea of a global settlement layer that people can access from anywhere in a permissionless way is a huge use case, and it's always going to be a huge use case. I think secondarily, as a store of value, people complain and talk about in the West how Bitcoin, is really volatile. I think over the last 6 months, it's been less so. But even historically, in the most volatile times, you look at African economies where you have hyperinflation and you have, devaluation at 25% every year as par for the course. And in some extremes, like, multiples of that, Bitcoin looks pretty stable to me, right?
Yeah.
You look at the long-term trajectory, right? Put it on a 4-year curve, 5-year curve, 10-year curve, like the curve is kind of going up, right? And so a lot of people are also realizing, look, if I have a long time preference, right, I can store my assets in Bitcoin, and all things being equal, I'm in a much better position than losing 25% of the value of my money in the bank, where I live. And so to me, those are just two no-brainer cases that I think as people come into the space, they began to realize and understand. And then I think the future of that is once you onboard enough people onto crypto, onto Bitcoin, onto Ethereum, when they start understanding DeFi, I think that's where you get into this sort of like, accelerated mode, right? Because all of a sudden, I can hold Bitcoin if I have a high risk tolerance. I can move into stable coins and earn a yield that's anchored to the US dollar. Like, how many people have access to that type of asset across Africa? Like, you can't get that in an African bank.
Yeah.
And so people are now realizing, oh, I can hold this virtual dollar, right? I could take conservative steps and make 2%, 3%. I could take more high risk steps and earn a lot more, right? As people become more savvy and understand. And I think that I'm extremely bullish about Africa because I think as people build more mass market and user friendly tools, right, and the system's already in place to onboard users, that you'll see a lot of adoption, right? Just because of the problems I stated early on, where it's just really challenging to live in some of these places and see your net worth literally drop off every year.
Yeah. It's, gosh, I mean, there's a lot of points you covered there that there are things that you have to either live it or you have to have family and friends that have lived it to understand like how lucky you are when you have a stable currency. And so this is something that I remember around the time I got into like crypto, which was, like a little over 3 years ago. I'm really rather like new to the space compared to like, I think you and others. And I quickly started to learn more about the stability of the US dollar and realizing that the volatility of the crypto markets, in most cases, my experience was this is nothing compared to what other people are living through. Right. And so what you're calling out there is like, sure, there's been drawdowns in Bitcoin and Ether and other tokens, but I mean, overall, if we're talking about the two the biggest ones in the room, which is Bitcoin and Ether, long term, I mean, they've been on an upswing and acting as a store of value. I think Ether is obviously being strengthened by like the DeFi narrative now. How about Akin? Do you have any thoughts on? Do you think it's more empowering with stable coins or Bitcoin? I guess Bitcoin or Ether as a store of value, like, or should they just not be compared because maybe it's apples and oranges?
I think they have different purposes, right? And my view is that they're all very useful in very different ways, right? I think that, Bitcoin as a store of value, as almost this reserve currency, I think is an extremely important role, and it'll become more important as time goes on, and crypto economy grows, right? The Bitcoin economy, because you'll have some sort of deflationary asset where the crypto economics or the economics of that asset are like set and they're hard, right? And everyone plays by the same rules who's accessing this asset. And I think that's extremely important because all fiat currencies are manipulated, period, for one purpose or the other, right? Yeah. And the goalpost is always moved forward. And with Bitcoin, it isn't, right? And I think that's extremely important and will become more important as we see more inflows, right, into Bitcoin as a hedge, as a risk asset, however someone wants to use it, right? I think the longer we go with Bitcoin remaining secure and becoming more secure, the more people start getting to the market. And we see institutions begin to talk about it. We see asset managers, family offices. And we see Grayscale growing at an extremely ridiculous clip, right? To me, those are all signals that the market is coming and is becoming more and more confident. MicroStrategy, Square, PayPal. I mean, we're going to talk about PayPal, but like, it's like you could see that wall coming, and it's almost getting to the point of it's going to be inevitable, right? And by the time the rest of everyone, by the time we reach mass market, it's like it's a good time to be getting in or to be in the space, in my view. So, I mean,
about 3 years ago, could you have imagined the progress that we have today? And it's across the board. It's stuff that anyone could have dreamed about. Like, for example, this news with PayPal, what Square's done, these like bigger companies, and really like the mass market that even shows up on TV talking more about Bitcoin as a store of value. But I saw Mike Novogratz was on CNBC this morning, and he was talking about Ethereum and DeFi for a moment, which I love Mike. I would love to have him on this show sometime. He's just fun to listen to. I hadn't heard him talk about this in a long time, and I was like, well, clearly, like, now you have however many people who saw that going, Ethereum, that's right. Like, I either recall that name or it's new, and they're hearing what is DeFi, and you're like, what? It's exposing more folks to this. But yeah, I think we're at a point now where all these macro conditions are laying the groundwork for people to really like hit a point where they're like, I can't ignore this any longer. Like, look at what's going on in the US with just like all of these stimulus bills, which I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I just, as I look at them, I'm like, we're going to pay the price for this in one way or another in the coming years. And it's a slower roll. It's definitely, like, I think, a privileged role compared to the conditions that you're describing in Nigeria. But regardless, like, I was trying to explain to my sister, I'm like, I mean, you understand all this money gets injected, and then, like, let's say stocks go up. Well, people who own that stock might sell the stock and they buy something else. Then they buy real estate. Then the real estate in that area rises. Then conditions to live rise. Then suddenly, eventually, at some point, your milk rises, because everything else, it's all ripple effects in the economy, and you end up with inflation, and it hurts. It hurts those that don't have a wage that's keeping up with or outperforming that inflation. And it's again, like, I think, like, for me, like, I had to, like, get into the crypto space to start to learn all of this and dig into really what sounds like some of the topics that, like, your dad might have covered with you growing up, like just living in a house where you have someone who's so financially literate, I guess, compared to my family. Akin, so what do you think is necessary then for us to move the needle on adoption? Like, what's missing right now? And like, this can be just globally, unless you want to, like, highlight what you think needs to happen in the US versus a market like Nigeria.
So, well, I'll step back a little bit and answer the statement you made around in Novogarts early today. And I think that the one thing that a question you asked actually around, could you have seen this coming? And yeah, I think so, right? Because 2-3 years ago, you had the Andreessen Horowitz of the world coming into crypto and making investments, right? You had the venture guys beginning to kind of put real money into crypto, setting up crypto divisions. You have crypto-only VC funds. And in many ways, I think one of the big differences between Ethereum and Bitcoin is a lot of what's going on in the DeFi space look more like venture bets.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Everything is not a currency, right? But everything is basically its own microeconomy, right? And so, to me, a lot of these assets and a lot of these networks, they look more like these interesting manifestations of traditional finance. So where you had, for example, a bank that has all this IP, has all these closed walls, has all these high paid staff, a lot of those things can be replaced by a protocol that's just programmed to like behave a certain way all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And what that does is, from a kind of like a first principle standpoint, like it moves, like there's this theory of the firm in economics, right, where that basically says the only reason why you're going to gather in a firm is for efficiency, right, and to get better market pricing, right? But in a normal circumstance, if you had a marketplace where there was very little information asymmetry, people could like organize and figure out counterparties relatively quickly and easily with very low cost, then the market would be the clearinghouse for transactions. And to me, that's pretty much what crypto networks are. They're a marketplace where access is very easy once you pretty much know how to enter that market. The rules are defined. Everyone plays by the same game. A lot of middlemen who are rent seekers are basically taking out of that marketplace such that you and I can transact in a marketplace that a big financial institution is as well on equal terms, right? And if you have superior intellect, you'll win in that market, right? And so for me, it's this idea that, wow, all of a sudden, things are being flipped. Like where we had firms that basically were the drivers of growth and wealth in marketplaces. And that's particularly in the United States, where that's really how the system is designed, right? Crypto networks are basically the democratization of access, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of stands at a slight polar opposite to TradFi or traditional finance. And so for me, like when I saw the venture guys coming in and making big bets, it's like a signal that typically the builders are the future, right? And they've seen waves come and go, right?
Yeah.
So the idea, in my view, that all right, they're seeing something that a lot of the market isn't, right? And they're making the bets that in 10 years and 15 years, it'll just seem like, oh, those are no brainers. It's no different from venture bets in Amazon or Facebook or any of these networks early on, where people just saw a shift in how this technology was going to drive change in the marketplace, and they made these bets and they were successful. And so that's kind of how I see, how things in basically the smart contract DeFi space evolving and how they look like. And I think they're going to be orders of magnitude bigger than what we see with like, Apple or Amazon in terms of their size.
Yeah. I think like what you were saying highlights, there's this statement that I use with friends and family when they're like struggling to understand something in DeFi, or maybe I'm trying to like explain something to them. If they get frustrated for a moment, I'm like, I'm telling you, let me show you this, because it's difficult to unsee the value. Once you send some stable coin to someone else with a wallet, or in the past it was sending Bitcoin or sending Ether. I mean, these are things that are impossible to unsee if you understand how that you're able to instantly settle these transactions. And like, I mean, I could give an example of I've done one wire transfer in the last few years, and it was just recent. I had forgotten how difficult it is to do because it was someone outside of my bank. I filled out a DocuSign. The DocuSign, which actually was like semi-convenient, at least I did it online to use that. Then they had to call me twice to do like a security type review. Like they basically asked me name and phone number and what value it was, making sure. And someone did it twice. I did it, and then they had to call back, and they're like, we're doing it just one more time. I appreciate that they were doing that. Like I guess it's like one way to keep my money safe, or to make sure that it doesn't get sent out to the wrong person. But, it just was like, wow, like this is so crazy how difficult this is in comparison to me just sending USDC to someone or DAI. I much prefer using, at this point, I get paid myself in DAI, and I love it because it's easy, because I can just get it paid out immediately. Akin, what use cases are you most excited about then in DeFi? Like what are some of the projects that you follow more closely and would encourage others to learn about?
Yeah. So I'll kind of talk about them in the order of getting involved. So Chainlink, I thought once I grasped and understood that, we're going to live in a world that, a dual world for a long time, right? If smart contracts are going to become what they could be, they're going to need to, consume information and accurate information to trigger, right, transactions, right? If a smart contract can enable a wire transfer or a bank transfer, then it needs to have and be sure that, that information is really, really important and correct. And, Chainlink basically, in my view, is this bridge between any kind of data source and smart contracts, wherever they might exist. And it empowers smart contracts to be able to accurately execute like they're supposed to, right? And so without accurate information, without an oracle that you can rely on, without these data feeds, then you kind of just have a nice software that really can only do things within its own ecosystem, but it becomes very, very limited. And in that vein, I also got really interested in REN protocol fairly early as well, because interoperability was something that, I think has been talked about for a long time. And, similar to Chainlink in many ways, like I kind of see REN as almost like building bridges that connects all these economies together. And once it's all built out, then you have international trade, right? You now have the ability to exist in any chain and transact in any chain, essentially, right? Because you can move the underlying value and swap in the back end from Ether to Bitcoin, Bitcoin to Polkadot, right? And if you understand, if you kind of like put that against the real world, right? The growth of the global economy really accelerated after World War II, and globalization started kind of taking hold, right? The U.S. as an economy, like most of the growth in the U.S. economy has been over the last 50 to 70 years, post World War II. And part of the reason for that is you now have a way to trade globally, right? And I think the same thing, I think REN will be the facility of that, and maybe a few other protocols in the crypto space, right? And really now bring this acceleration of, I think, use cases. There'll be all sorts of cool things you'll be able to do that, we haven't quite been able to do yet. And then I really got into more recently Barbridge. And you've had a couple of folks in the last couple of weeks come and talk. So I want to rehash that. But I think Barbridge for me was really, really important because it's almost like the culmination of a lot of things I've done in my career. When I was at Fannie and Freddie, it's structured finance, it's mortgage-backed securities, it's all these like debt pools, right, that have a yield. And the real innovation with these debt pools is that you can splice and cut them up across a yield curve or curve, right? So if you have an investor that says, I really want to be conservative, right? If the housing market blows up, I want to be paid first, and I'm willing to take a huge discount to the value of the pool. If a pool is, say, yielding 7% in aggregate, right? I don't know, 100,000 homes in one pool, and the yield is 7%. That guy might say, look, I want the first money and I'll take 3%. Some other guy says, look, I want a piece of that pool, but I want the junior tranche or the more high risk tranche. And I want, 12, 13% for my trouble, right? So it creates this way where you can take all these pools and these assets that look pretty like illiquid. Right? So you think about a mortgage pool, right? A house is fairly liquid, right? Because you just can't sell it every hour or on an exchange. And it puts it into a pool, right, which is an asset-backed security, and you can now trade it in a marketplace. And then you can take that pool and chop it up into even smaller bits, and all of a sudden, like, you can have more buyers and sellers trading all these pieces, right? And Barbridge, basically, the way I understood it was that's basically what they're trying to do in the DeFi space, right? Is this idea that you can create derivatives of yield products, and you can basically now chop them up into different yielding assets based on risk. And I think that creates now the kinds of products that the guys on Wall Street would intimately understand, because that's what they trade every day. Like the debt markets are larger than the equities markets, right? Globally. And because they understand the product, right? They understand what it's doing. And they sit in a place where you're having, high inflation, all this money printing, devaluation definitely is going to come. Right. Then now, for me, if I'm on Wall Street and I'm seeing what Barbridge is doing, it's like, wow, that's the future of what I do. Right. And if the network is secure, right? If you can create these on-ramps, if you can have custody, like all the things that you need to sort of for a regular entity to kind of play in the space, which are being built out, then to me it becomes a no-brainer because you'll have, all these inflation at risk assets and money, in my
Yeah.
view, going into crypto and into platforms like Barbridge where they can get a yield, right? They can trade a tradable asset in a fair marketplace. And as long as there's liquidity and you can move in and out of positions, then like the cost advantage of trading on a protocol will always outweigh trading with a counterparty on Wall Street, right? Who is getting paid very handsomely for making that market. And so for me, that's kind of where I see the future going, why I'm really, really excited about Barbridge. And it also just taps into the things I know and things I've always been interested in. So like when I saw it, I was like, wow, like I think that's the one, to me, that's the one thing that I would not have anticipated coming this quickly. And so it's
that is one of the best explanations of Barbridge. I definitely recognized this week that there were lots of folks, I think like you and me, that were very excited because we recognized what it was right away. But it's difficult because some of this it's not clear unless you've had that exposure to those products from like a Wall Street, or at least that if you've ever dealt with them. One question I had for you, you may or may not know this, or maybe it hasn't been figured out yet by Barbridge, but I guess who or how will it be decided what goes into each tranche? Like that's something that as I was actually, I could share my screen here because I had Barbridge's website up. Um, and we don't have to dig much more into it. Just like that was a really great explanation of what they're trying to do. And actually, can you clarify? I know you're a part of the community. Are you also working with the team? Like it's kind of one and the same, but are you like, anyways, have you taken a role with Barbridge or just participating in the?
So I'm just participating, like like a lot of eager folks that just want to see this successful.
Yeah, cool.
And, have some value to add, right? I think we'll see how things progress, but it's definitely like it's a really interesting place to be because it's like it's very familiar in certain ways, right? And I think that a lot of my experience, especially around like crypto governance, can have value in the space. I think there's a lot of just conversation around that. So it's like, it's like almost like walking into a familiar place and just meeting people that understand what you're saying and you can have conversations with. Like it's easy in that sense. And we'll see how things evolve. I think to your first question around, how these assets are going to be built, I think, from what I understand, the first couple of products are being worked on by the team and, some of the, I guess, the seed round investors who have experience in the space. And I think what will probably eventually happen, and because that's typically what happens also in traditional finance, is you'll have like counterparts or users ask you to build certain things, like because it's like you get a taste of like a structured product, like, and that's basically how like Wall Street evolved. Like some guy built something really interesting, right? It worked, right? From a risk adjusted standpoint, like it was like, okay, that's a great asset. And your customer starts asking you questions like, oh, could you do this? Or could we structure something that looks like this, right? And if you have a lot of people asking you for the same thing, then that's your next product, right? That's no different from running a tech firm or wherever, where you have core customers who are using the product, who love it, who are, rabid fans, and they're making feature requests. Like, it'll be nice to really have this, or here's a pain point, right? And I think the same thing will probably happen in with Barbridge, especially because you have an open community, right? And you have anyone can participate, anyone can kind of string up conversations. I think that's really the biggest advantage of crypto, where like, anyone with intellect can come in and make a contribution, and you can crowdsource ideas and you can get into all these like tangential conversations. And to me, that's where like magic happens, right? That's where people start putting two and two together and putting heads. And the fact that you have like an interdisciplinary group of people, like things happen in the crypto space that wouldn't naturally happen almost anywhere else, because you don't necessarily have that diversity of thought in a singular Discord channel. Like,
it's insane how accessible teams are, and like it's funny because like as I was asking you, like, oh, do you have like a dedicated role? Basically, like, are you employed by Barbridge? And that's something that's really special is that, you know, if you're someone who has an expertise and, you know, as long as we're talking about teams that listen well, you can very quickly have a incredibly positive impact on the trajectory of different DeFi applications. There's no doubt, like Discord has been this incredibly powerful community building tool, and
Right. And even to add to that, I think I think it might be helpful too for people. I think that's a very important point on how do you get into crypto. Like, I got in because I was curious about solving one problem in particular, and it opened up into a whole world that I didn't expect, right? And I got into crypto governance and into Decred primarily because I've been following Chris Berniski for a while, and getting into DMs, asking probably lots of dumb questions, right? Reading his threads, reading the placeholder theses, and I was learning a lot.
yeah.
And like you said, access, right? It's like you just find one person, two people, and you find other people, right? You get into their conversations, you're reading things, and you're building an understanding, and you're also adding that to the framework you bring to the table, right? And that's how I got involved with Decred. That's how I got asked to join to help around governance, and spent 18 months there, right? That's how I kind of just walked down into other communities and just said, oh, this is interesting, like I have something to add. And it's oftentimes, I think it's challenging for people who come from traditional backgrounds where you actually interview for a job, and a much more structured process. It can be really difficult to sort of walk into the crypto space. But I think for people that come from more of a venture background or startups, or it's a little easier just to sort of run with the flow and figure out where you fit. But I think there'll be more structure that comes along with that too over time. But to me, it's a very interesting way it's a very sort of community-driven way to participate, and essentially, like, the cream rises to the top, right? Those who show interest, those who are excited, those who are adding value, right? Your value will be rewarded. I think if you're in the right community, it will be rewarded over time, right? And I think you could, I don't know, the term is shoot your shot, like ask questions, like talk to these people. They're accessible, right? And even to the and that's how to a large extent Barbridge even started, right? It was Tyler who made some bold steps to have some of the right conversations, and one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden he finds himself putting a team together and building this thing. Like, that's the story of of DeFi, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like that, if you ask questions, if you're enthusiastic, and if you stick around, it's pretty cool how you can quickly build really strong relationships, and teams will find a way to put you to work, whether you're working in the community to help, again, the long-term growth of a protocol, or whether it's a full-time role. Geez, I had a follow-up to that. Did you have any lessons from working at Decred that you think could be applied to the DeFi space? Because I tend to think about strength in governance with Decred, or at least, like, I think that's from me, like, following Chris as well. Like, Chris is he was very bullish on Decred, I think still is, and I always was gathering that there was a lot of focus on building a good foundation in terms of governance.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that a lot of my perspective has really kind of got really solidified, like just heads down working with Decred, right? Because I think governance is extremely important. Having a fair game, right? A system where people kind of know the rules, and the rules are like essentially always, to a large extent, right, followed through on, right? And you build a systematic way for people to understand how to interact. I think it's very important because it builds transparency. I think Decred on top of that too, like from a dev standpoint and just building, we've been through a phase where in DeFi where, the term test and production has become, went from this, potentially interesting word to dirty word in a short period of time. And Decred is basically the antithesis of test and production. Like, we build things that are basically market ready, right? And I think that's really important, right? Because there's a discipline in engineering, there's a discipline in how things are built and done, and that's really important, right? I think having and making sure that you're building tools that people can use and they're not going to lose their money because of some error or some mistake in your code.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very laudable. On the other side of it too, I think that there's sort of lots to learn, right? So when I think about what's going on with DeFi and Ethereum, I think that the superpower of Ethereum is composability and the way the community is designed, right? So it's not just composability in terms of these financial building blocks. It's actually like composability in terms of teams, right? Yeah. If you look at how, like, even Barbridge, look at some of the LPs that, some of the people who invested early in Barbridge. It's like folks that have built, DeFi protocols that work. Like everyone sort of contributes and adds value because they see how seeding the next round of protocols or products like essentially feed back to the base primitives, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm a Lend or Aave, or if I'm a Curve or whatever, like I want to see things built that take advantage of the money markets I've developed, right? Because if the economy is growing and they're growing, then it accrues to me, right? Because I'm a baseline building block, right? And I think that's the genius of, in my view, like how that ecosystem, the Ethereum ecosystem works. And it now creates this, exponential growth because you can now have teams building on each other. You have a lot of communication. You have a lot of sharing of code. Like you can't beat that. Like I'll take a stand. Like it'll be very hard to assail Ethereum, right? Yeah. Because now I think you'll have protocols that do well too if they build on those virtues, right? Yeah. But at some point, like you reach like an event horizon where it's really hard to like want to build anything in DeFi elsewhere. Now, interoperability could help that, where I could build on another chain and I can kind of take advantage of stuff. And I think we'll see some of that going on. But I think Ethereum becomes like, as long as, they don't screw it up, it's going to be a mainstay. And I think so. That's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question. I think that cultures that are open, that, experiment, that let new people in, give you a holding hand, that let opinions come in that might be counter to even your vision, and you let those conversations sort of potentially like redirect how you think. Yeah, I think that's extremely important because as quickly as crypto moves, right, your vision of the world like should change like almost every month, right? Because there's always something new. There's a new primitive, a new tool that kind of effectively makes what you might have been building almost redundant, and you might have to either incorporate, work with someone else, right? And I think that without that, like you're just sort of like an island unto yourself, right? And I think that's the risk that older products or older projects have run the risk of just becoming irrelevant as the world moves against you. So I don't know. I think a culture that's very open and willing to do whatever it takes to expand the network while holding to your virtues and your values. I think that's a balance, right? I think is important, right? And I think if the core of your community is strong, then that will support new people coming in, and sort of it's kind of like a two-way thing, right? You kind of have to fit into the community and understand what's going on, but also have the opportunity to kind of add value and bring new things, right? So I think just managing that balance becomes extremely important.
Yeah. Do you think then, has Bitcoin lost this narrative about, you mentioned with how quickly things move, your perspective should be changing month to month. And I'm not advocating that you don't hold to your convictions, that you lose focus and are a person who's more chaotic and not realizing that like it takes time to solve really big problems. Like, I think what you were describing about the Ethereum community, and I would count myself still as a part of the Bitcoin and the Ethereum community. Yep. I'm silent to the Bitcoin community now because I get excited when I talk with you about when you're telling me, yeah, like there's real people who are clearly benefiting from just exposure to Bitcoin and being able to like opt out of their local currency. Yeah. But then I think like when I hop into like a Twitter, I'm just bombarded by like these these maximalist, insane sorts of like shouting matches. So
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I guess like I guess I'm asking you to comment on the state of the community for Bitcoin versus like an Ethereum.
So I think that because you can opt in and out and participate wherever you want,
Yeah,
I think a lot of these maximalist debates are kind of a waste of time to some extent.
totally. Yeah,
And because like I think for the vast majority of people, they'll like they'll participate wherever they want, right? And I think there's certain things about Bitcoin being like ossified and like stable and fixed that are actually good for what Bitcoin is trying to solve long term, which for me is just this digital gold, store of value, reliable, security. Like that's okay. Like it's okay to have one or two things in the space that just one thing, right? And I think that Bitcoin as that reserve currency, right, status is not a bad thing, and actually has been, in my view, good for the rest of crypto for a while, right? Because for a long time,
absolutely. Yeah.
Bitcoin was the only pair, right? It's the unramp, right? It's volatile, but I can get into Bitcoin, and from Bitcoin to Ether and wherever else, right?
Right.
And I think that what could happen, right? I think Bitcoin might be seen as this hedge, right? This hard asset, and it could just remain that forever and just appreciate forever, and that's okay because you have all these other venture parallel economies also growing and potentially, like, I think there'll be a time when, frankly, like certain chains will totally decouple from Bitcoin, where you don't need Bitcoin to ramp yourself on, right? You can use a stable coin, right? I
Right.
think
Right.
these networks will have their own monetary premium. And it's like, right, when we start moving away from centralized exchanges to like already DEX is becoming a big venue for transactions, right? I think Bitcoin will just serve the purpose to whomever wants to use it, however, and it doesn't take away from other networks growing and garnering their own monetary premium and their own sort of view on the world. So, and the other side, the other thing I'll say, which is a lesson I learned this week. A buddy of mine, we we're having a conversation, with this, it's like a bunch of my classmates from high school. We're debating some of what's going on in Nigeria. For a lot of people who don't know, there's just been a lot of there's a peaceful protest and led by, and just people can kind of look it up. Look at my timeline. There's a lot around that. And we're having this debate and was kind of very adversarial at one point. A buddy of mine took me, kind of slid into my DMs and said, look, like, it's good to know what the other side thinks, even though you don't agree, because you learn something from it. At the very least, you'll learn how they think, you'll learn their perspective. And potentially, when you think about like game theory or strategy for war, like you kind of want to know what the enemy's thinking. You want to be in their head constantly. Like you want to seem like a neutral party, because that's intelligence. That's important to know, right? And if you're in a space where you're just kind of blocking discourse or blocking conversations or hard in your viewpoints, like you end up being the loser, right? And so I think for people that kind of take very hard positions, the world is changing around you and you're kind of stuck in a particular vision, like you end up being the loser. Like I don't have to convince you. Like I don't feel the need to convince people who are like set in their ways, right? I feel the need to kind of collaborate with people who are open, and there's enough of those people in crypto that you can ignore the noise.
I like that. I actually purposely don't block many people. I mean, you have to really like cross a line, like for me to block someone.
Right.
And it's because I actually I get something like you were saying out of listening to those that I might disagree with. And I might roll my eyes at times and get annoyed by folks. I'm sure they get annoyed by me, but like it is so helpful. Like I have learned a lot from the Bitcoin community about what needs to happen in DeFi with Ethereum to be successful. And I talk to a lot of people who are brand new to this space, who know nothing about the history of Bitcoin and Ethereum and crypto in general. And you know what? They don't give a shit. They just want to use what works. And they get drawn, I think, very obviously to Bitcoin and Ethereum. But, there's a chance in the future that we'll have those interoperable bridges like Ren, that I think Ren has been one of the most impressive.
Yeah, I mean, look at the amount of Bitcoin and Ethereum. Like that's people like that's
Yes,
people like talking with their money. Like so, I think to some extent there's a lot of maximalism. There's an echo chamber in Twitter, but when you see like the volume of WBTC and the volume of Ren migrating into into Ethereum, well, those are holders, right? Who are now accessing these chains to get yield, right?
absolutely.
I mean, look at that line. It's like it's parabolic. And so for me,
Crazy.
it's like you can argue all you want, but like you can't argue with that fact that's on the screen currently. That
Yes.
shows that there's a growing number of people who might just want to hold Bitcoin because they believe in everything that encapsulates it, but they want to get a yield, they want to get a return, they want to invest in some sort of venture-like asset because they need to diversify their risk. Like that's common sense. That's not like, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And I think it'll be proven out like that networks will kind of feed into other networks and people will be able to carry their value wherever they want, store it wherever they want, transact like that is the promise of crypto. That basically was the thesis, like, freedom, right? So you can't tell me I'm not free to have an opinion that you don't like because you're a maximalist and there should only be one Bitcoin. That's the most ridiculous thing. That goes against the ethos of why Bitcoin was actually even built.
Yeah.
So maximalism is not, in my view, in line with what Satoshi wrote in the white paper in any way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just difficult to unsee stuff like this, and I think that we see a lot of arguments, used to ignore Ethereum and DeFi right now that were actually used against Bitcoin a long time ago. Akin, this is probably a good time to touch on what do you think about all of the incredibly bullish and exciting news with PayPal? Like, how do you digest that news and the fact that they are supposedly looking to acquire companies in the space? Like the rumor is that it's BitGo, or I think it was semi-confirmed by the block.
Yeah, I think it's the most bullish thing we've heard in a long time. I think to put things in context, Square has been sort of like a leader. Jack Dorsey talking a lot about, it's been a place where a lot of people buy Bitcoin, a lot of millennials buy Bitcoin. If you look at their earnings announcements, grows exponentially like every quarter. But now you have PayPal that is an order of magnitude larger, right? 26 million retail outlets, an order of magnitude larger in terms of user base. And all of a sudden, those people have the ability to buy crypto. Like that's a massive on-ramp. And regardless of the issues around it being a walled garden, you can't like send value in and out. Like once people get a taste of it and start understanding it, then they can migrate and go elsewhere, right? It's the same way, like I got into crypto for the first time and bought Bitcoin and Ether and Coinbase, right?
Right.
Coinbase to Kraken to Binance to Bittrex. Like you hopped around because in the early days, like, certain tokens only showed up in certain exchanges. So I guarantee you, if you've been in the space for like 4 or 5 years, you've been through like 10 exchanges, right? And then you had Uniswap and DEXs, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't need exchanges anymore. So I think it'll be an on-ramp, not just for people for the first time buying crypto, but they've talked about also building a lot of education into the platform. And I think that's huge because all of a sudden people can learn, they can understand in a very relatively safe space. And to me, that becomes the biggest value because once you know and understand and you know where to go for information and you're basically leveling up in your understanding, then it's over. Like you're tipped onto the other side. And like you said, you can't unsee what you've learned, right? And that becomes to me extremely bullish, right? I haven't been more bullish about the future of the crypto space than I am over the last couple of weeks. And, with PayPal being the culmination, but all the things that happened before, with Square announcing about 50 million Bitcoin, with MicroStrategy spending over 400 million, like it's like, okay, it's like almost now a wave of just continuous news. And it's like adoption is like here.
Yeah. It's what's that like saying? It's like slowly and then all at once suddenly, something like that. I just totally butchered it, but that's what it's been. It's been a really exciting time, and we're definitely living through like a really special time in history. Like I think I know I will definitely look back and say, wow, I just didn't realize everything that was coming. I know even a year ago, if you asked me about what was happening in DeFi, I was rambling to all my family and friends like, this is the killer use case. Like this, this goes beyond me having to explain like monetary policy. And I would always go down the rabbit hole and try to explain like, well, like there are people in the world who don't have Venmo and exposure to the US dollar.
Right.
And that conversation eventually would either it would work or it fell upon deaf ears. But with DeFi, it was like, okay, here's now a totally parallel finance system, and it plays off of all of the principles that excited us about Bitcoin and Ethereum. So yeah, just a really special time we're living through. Akin, are you okay to go 5 more minutes? I had one question that someone asked in the live stream that I forgot to ask you about. So I can show it on screen. Can you speak to some of the governance and regulations that are needed for crypto, especially in Africa, where it's relatively new? Any thoughts on that?
I want to put a plug. That's my younger sister that asked that question.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much.
So I think that there needs to be. So I think many countries in Africa are beginning to have some definition around rules and regulations. I'd caution like African countries from kind of putting too many hard and fast rules early, just because our market's a lot more fragile, and you kind of need to let things run and take a certain course. Like, yeah, have consumer protections, but like I would skew on the side of letting innovation kind of run amok for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And just because I feel like there'll be certain products that come out of Africa that don't exist anywhere else and will essentially become exports, right? And if you don't let the ecosystems develop, or you don't create an environment where they can thrive, then you'll stifle it, right? And you'll kill that potential. I also think that crypto, from a governance standpoint, just the idea of these open markets, open protocols, fair governance, I think that's a huge potential use case for Africa, where we have very poor governance. We have, just governments that do things when it's convenient, like under the guise of democracy, but like there's no consistency in application. Like, yeah. I think that crypto as a new marketplace where it's fair for people to participate is a huge opportunity. And I think whether or not regulators on the continent like it or not, incumbents like it or not, it's here, and it's going to take over these markets. So we need the governments and the regulators need to start thinking about ways to harness that, the change that's coming, and really default to thinking about the people and what's best for the man on the street who's just trying to make, a little more money and feed his family. Like, that should be the default thinking. It shouldn't be about the banks. It shouldn't be about the politicians, and I think if our governments aren't careful to manage this well and shepherd this well, like, they'll get wiped out, right? Either from the fact that the economy is an informal economy. Africa's informal economy is still 70% of the economy. Like, 70% of Africa does not do anything in the formal economy. They're not banking. They don't have bank accounts. Like, they're doing things on the street, trading, do whatever, right? That big portion of the economy will migrate somewhere else, and it'll weaken these governments. It'll make them less relevant, and I think they'll die they'll die a difficult death. And it could look slow, but I just think that when markets are unleashed and they're open, you cannot bring globalization back. Right? You can't say we're not going to be a globalized world anymore and everyone's just going to be nationalistic. Like, if you do that, you end up losing, because the rest of the world will just continue on doing that. Right? So I think this is an opportunity for real leadership to emerge, to pretty much say, look, Nigeria has the youngest population in the world. The average age is 18 and a half. You have over 40 million young people who are either unemployed or underemployed. That's either an asset that you can take advantage of, that basically ushers these countries into the future, or it's basically potentially the seeds of revolution, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, 40 million people that have no future, right, will take that future from you, right?
Mhm.
And there will be revolts. And we've seen like birth pangs, right? We've seen around the world where there have been these things that erupt. And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit emotional about it because of what's happened in Nigeria over the last week, with a peaceful demonstration that basically went bad with the government basically shooting innocent people that were unarmed, right? And to a large extent, a lot of, I'll say this one story. Initially when things and the demonstrations started happening, a lot of people were just donating money to the cause from wherever, and the government basically shut down their bank accounts, right? And all of a sudden they just spun up a BTC pay server and nothing stopped. Like people were donating Bitcoin. I was tweeting about it all week, right? I sent Ether and thank God the gas prices have been low. Like I sent Ether in 4 seconds, and the other guy got it. And people, people are being fed at the demonstrations. Folks that probably haven't had 3 meals a day were having 3 meals a day. Like the guy on the street might have no clue what Bitcoin is, but he knows that Bitcoin fed him over the last week, right? And he's gonna start asking questions. What is this Bitcoin? Like, how can I access it? Right? What does it mean for my future? Right? The genie's out of the bottle, right? And I think that smart regulators should start thinking about how they can appeal to the people, how they can create an environment that ensures that the wealth that can be generated from decentralized networks, the access that it gives, is a thriving, growing economy in our countries. Because if they stifle it in any way, or they try to stop it, or they try to put curbs on it to kind of sustain the incumbents or sustain the politically connected, I fear what might happen. Right.
Yeah.
But I'm optimistic, and I think that if we do what we're doing, if I do what I'm doing, if bridges are being built, if opportunities and interoperability is connecting to the formal world, and investments can come in, and there's a fair market for participating, my optimism is that business will drive change, right? And as people see these opportunities, the balance gets tipped, right? And I think smart politicians would now recognize that and should shift or change.
Do you think that we can reach more new users in DeFi, crypto in general, through through some of the usual digital channels like a YouTube? Or one of the things that I've thought a lot about over the past 12 months, and been trying to interview others and ask friends, I would love to see more people be empowered with DeFi. And I've talked a lot to others in Argentina, and then I've done a few interviews with folks from different parts of Africa. Right. And I keep coming back to this thought that it feels like this needs to be a campaign on the ground. You can't just expect, in my case, to put up tutorials on YouTube and hope for the best. I know that they're reaching folks, but I just worry. I assume it is just clearly not enough, and that we need to really think about creating people-based networks on the ground and pushing hard on adoption.
Yeah, I think you got it perfectly right. You need to find the right intermediaries to interact with, right? You need to look at the dev communities in Africa, right? Growing at, I think there's a stat I saw about GitHub, that the largest growing economy or community in GitHub for a long time is Nigerians.
Wow.
Literally, right? Because, software development is something that an intelligent person can kind of self-learn, right? You have access to tools, you have people teaching each other, you have people who are self-taught, right? They may not have the structure and discipline you might have from growing up at a Microsoft, but they're intelligent people, right? That out of necessity are building things. It's those communities we need to access, the builders, right? Getting them on platforms, getting them understanding how to build things, right? Because they'll understand the language of coding and understand the language of what's being built, but they know where they're from, right? They'll know how to translate that to products people can use. They'll know, for example, that in my view, if you're going to get mass adoption of crypto in Nigeria, right, you got to advertise in the radio or have radio shows, and you might have to speak broken English. Right? Broken English is the most widely spoken and understood language in Nigeria, right? Nigeria has over 240 languages. English is a national language. The majority of people do not speak proper English. but everybody understands broken English, right? So if I was going to run a campaign that was going to hit the mass market and create a fintech tool, I'm going to have ads in broken English. If I want the little guy on the street to use my product, simple. I'm going to use radio because everyone listens to radio, right? The CEO who's in traffic for 3 hours a day is listening to the radio. The guy on the street corner charging like iPhones for a living is on the radio. And both of them speak broken English. Like, to me, it's like, so like a lot of people wouldn't understand that inherently, but like every dev in Nigeria should know that. Like, and so you integrate with those people, you bring something to the table, right? They build tools, and then you use those as funding channels too, right? When you make those links, right? And investors now understand what's going on in Africa. They understand the market opportunity, right? That's the reason why startups, and if you look at the startups that have been the most successful across Africa, they're run by locals.
Yeah.
You know, last week, you know, the startup called Paystack, it's like a 4-year, they were the first Nigerian startup in Y Combinator. They just sold to Stripe for $200 million.
Wow.
They just, like, literally, they got bought. Like, Google it up, Paystack, Stripe, right? And this is two smart guys, built something incredible. They wanted to be the Stripe of Africa. And, you know, they kind of jokingly said, now we're the Stripe of Africa because Stripe acquired us, right? There are dozens of folks just like that. Wow. Right? They can build intelligent tools, customize it for those economies, and there'll be $200 million, billion-dollar businesses coming out of Nigeria over the next couple of decades. That's the opportunity, right? Wow. And to me, crypto networks are the ultimate way to access those markets, right? Because it's permissionless. You can get around incumbents. You can translate it to the average user, and you can liberate them, right, from under the thumb of, you know, the formal financial system and poor governance. Mm-hmm. And so that for me is, you know, one of the biggest drivers for me in being in crypto is, yeah, it's great, it's fun, all these things I'm getting out of it personally. But like, I remember where I come from. Like, I remember my classmates I talk to every day on WhatsApp who are stuck, right, in an economy where you can work as hard as you want, but like 9 times out of 10, the system is going to like destroy you one way or the other. Bad policy, bad governance, inflation, like things totally out of your control, bad education, like, but you now have startups, young people solving their own problems, right? You have channels developing where funding is coming in, and, you know, a good friend of mine runs a tool. I'll put a plug. He runs an app called ULesson, right? It's basically like an app where, because of coronavirus, right? And they started before then, but it's like you can take a class online on the phone. Right, it's the best app I've ever seen for education. Like, my kids go to school in Loudoun County here in Virginia, right? The tools my kids use for distance learning are not as good as this app. Like, in my view, like, I downloaded the app, I've looked around it, like, it's the best thing I've seen for an education app, and it's built out of Jos in Nigeria, right? To me, that's a channel. Like, if I was going to develop any content around like crypto to educate young people, I'm going to call them up. Yeah, I'll call Sim and say, I've been meaning to actually. I'll call Sim and say, look, how do we develop content such that, you know, the 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old is getting financial education and understands, you know, crypto protocols? Like, that's the future. Like, I want to educate millions of Nigerians such that 10 years from now, it's those guys building the future, right? To me, that's the strategy. That's the long game. And that's how we win, right? That's how we defeat incumbents, bad governance. I mean, that's how we defeat, wow, you know, the U.S. dominance. You know, that's a whole different conversation. But, you know, the U.S. hegemony in Africa and around the world, that's how you beat it, right? You beat it by, you know, building people up and leveraging what you can see. And so that's why I'm really, really excited about crypto and what it can bring back to the continent and how it can play a role to support that.
I just keep having more questions because I'm just fascinated by everything you're sharing. I think this is a good final question. Sure. So what are you working on right now? I mean, you're involved in lots of different crypto communities. We talked about Ren. You formerly worked full-time for Decred. You're very involved, obviously, with Barbridge. Yeah, tell me more about, like, what are you working on right now, or can we get you to work with us more with Zapper? That's something else we'll talk about later.
So the way I've talked to my wife about this actually recently. We've had these conversations, and the way I kind of think about it is, you know, there'll always be like a handful of projects I'm always working with, whether I'm paid or not. just because I'm really
Yeah.
interested in seeing this thing through. And it's hard not to remain engaged because you see it being built, right? You see things coming to fruition and you know that, look, this is a 20-year game, right? So for me, it's like, I'll always be involved with 2, 3, 4 products at a time, right? I might be like, 80% focused on one thing at any given point in time, but
Yeah.
it'll be hard not to have that optionality of being in the marketplace, right? And just seeing what's going on. And because that's where, for me, you remain relevant. That's what's exciting. Like, there's always something new, right?
Yeah.
And I think, it appeals to my, ADD tendencies of, I'm either 0 or 100. It's either like I'm running at 100% and if things in the air, like there's always something to do, or it's
You're,
0, right?
you're preaching to the choir. That's just it. I joined Zapper because I could never stop focusing on all that's happening in DeFi. And I was like, okay, this is like one place that's like an aggregator of everything. So I guess this could work.
And that's why DeFi and Ethereum is also great because I think regardless of where you are, you're kind of forced to be part of a broader community.
Yes.
So it just incents you to always, know what's happening. Someone's talking about some new project. I mean, the reason why I found out about Barbridge is because Kane tweeted about it a couple of months ago and said, "Oh, Barbridge is the project I'm most excited about." And when Kane said that, I'm like, "Okay, who are these guys? Like, what are they about?" Like, and I kind of ignored it for a while, but I kept coming back to it, right?
Yeah.
And to me, it's like that's how you kind of know what's going on. If Kane thinks something is important, then, or that's the project I didn't talk about, like synthetics. I've also been quite involved for the last over a year, just because I understood what they're trying to build, and I just thought, look. Synthetic assets, derivative assets are a massive market.
It's huge.
Whoever wins that or has a space in that. And so it's just, I just jumped into things I kind of understood and just thought, wow, if this is solved and it's built and it's successful, like these are going to be the things, synthetics is going to be the thing that replaces the NASDAQ and like the Dow and all these like closed markets. Which, by the way, everyone can't transact in, right? Everyone can transact in synthetics. Not everyone can like buy a stock on the NASDAQ globally.
That's right? The thing. There's always been this excitement for me about the fact that someone can buy as small amount as they want. I mean, pending like what they can afford with whatever the gas prices were at that time on Ethereum. Right. But the ability to buy into let's say like a Google stock eventually, or to buy like, I want to see an index like the S&P 500, the Dow Jones. They have 2 of them right now. It's the Nikkei and the FTSE, but super excited to see more of that coming. And that is, to me, like there's this litmus test of like when you try to explain this to someone, if they can very quickly dismiss it and say, what do I need that for? I have Robinhood or this and that. I'm like, oh, I don't really care about getting you to adopt this. Like you're not the person I'm concerned about. Yeah. It's the person who's like, what? Oh, I have no other option. Like, or it's incredibly difficult or next to impossible for me to get access to. That's the person where it can be life-changing for them to exposure to the US dollar, to earn yield on that, to be able to store it and sleep at night and know that their funds won't be seized by some corrupt authorities. Like those are the people that we need to reach, not the trust fund kid that lives in New York, who's playing with play money. So
we need them both.
yeah. I guess, we do need them both. Well, Akins, so great to have you on. I just want to remind everyone they can follow you on Twitter here. I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you too, just about like we think a lot at Zapper about how to reach new folks, new users. And I think you've inspired me with a number of ideas that we can talk more about, but just thank you so much for your time. We kept you much longer than expected today, but in all honesty, I would have kept asking you questions if I just didn't feel badly about keeping you here this long.
That's okay. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Akin, anything else that folks should know in terms of like keeping up with you and like following your work or any of just anything you would recommend?
Not really. I mean, I think the most current thing you can learn about me and what I'm doing is on Twitter, right? I've become more and more open about just sharing what I'm thinking and what I'm working on and sharing my thoughts. And so, like, dig into my Twitter threads,
Yeah. Yes.
send me a DM, particularly if you're like, African developers building really cool stuff. Like, I tend to like give more time, because I think that's one way I can give back, helping these guys on the African continent, African Americans, whomever, but people from like underserved backgrounds who are kind of trying to make sense of what's going on in crypto and how they can be involved and build things. Like, I tend to give extra time for that, just because, I'm one of the fortunate ones who sits in a position where I've had access, right? And I'd be doing myself a disservice if I wasn't supporting, other people who are trying to come behind me, just like the Chris's of the world, like,
Totally. I read Chris Bernitzky's Crypto Assets book in early or mid 2017, whenever it came out. And that was one of the things that tipped me towards working in this community. And yeah, I think like if everyone thought about where their journey started, you realize like you could be messaging with someone on Twitter who's going to build the next big thing. And so you should treat everybody with that respect and try to help others. Like, to me, like it's every direct message matters. Everyone deserves some attention and some help, and that's really how the community will continue to grow and flourish. So, well, anyways, hey, the playback for this full episode will be on tv.zapper.fi, so folks can subscribe there. And Akin, we'd love to have you back sometime. If you ever even have like some just ideas or lessons you'd like to share, you can come on for a few minutes, and I don't have to drag you through a 90-minute interview.
Sure. No problem.
But otherwise, thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We'll be back next week. We've got like, I think 4 new episodes, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, of Yield TV. And so, yeah, have a safe weekend, and we'll see you next time.